The mail-order bride's whispered confession hung in the air like smoke from a dying campfire. "I've been aching down there," she admitted, her eyes fixed on the weathered floorboards of his remote cabin. The lonely cowboy just listened, his silence as vast as the prairie stretching beyond his window. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The heavy door of Dr. John Smith's office closed behind Maria Costa with the cold finality of a tomb. The polished brass nameplate caught the afternoon light, mocking her with its permanence, while her own future had just been measured in months. 6 months. The words echoed in her mind as she stepped onto the bustling streets of Boston, numb to the autumn wind that sliced through her coat. Maria clutched her worn handbag against her chest, as if it might shield her heart from the truth. Passers-by hurried around her, merchants closing shops, mothers calling children home, workers returning from factories, all with destinations, all with tomorrows stretching endlessly before them. How strange to stand among them, invisible in her mortality. Her thoughts remained trapped in the chemical-scented office, where Dr. Smith's careful sympathy had offered no comfort. "Your heart is failing, Miss Costa. I must be honest, you do not have long." The physician had spoken gently, his eyes dropping to the papers on his desk when she asked how long. "Perhaps half a year, with proper rest." Rest. As if she could afford such luxury. The former nurse understood the diagnosis better than most patients would. Each irregular heartbeat, each moment of breathlessness now carried terrible meaning. She had seen this before, in the yellow fever wards, the gradual weakening, the body betraying itself. But she had never imagined becoming the patient. Maria wandered aimlessly among golden leaves and busy strangers, each step reminding her that her road was running out. Carriages clattered past, splashing through puddles left by the morning rain. A newspaper boy shouted headlines about railroad expansions westward. The world continued its relentless forward motion while her own had screeched to a halt. 4 years since the epidemic had claimed her family, leaving her utterly alone in this vast city. 4 years of rented rooms and mended clothes and careful budgeting. 4 years of surviving, only to die anyway. A church bell tolled the hour, startling her from her thoughts. She needed to return to Mrs. Clara Oliveira's boarding house before darkness fell. The landlady would be serving dinner soon, calling her tenants to the table with the same motherly concern she showed each evening. Would Maria tell her? Would she tell anyone? What purpose would it serve, except to invite pity she couldn't bear? As she turned toward home, Maria noticed her reflection in a shop window. Pale, thin, unremarkable, just another working woman in a city full of them. Yet beneath her simple appearance beat a heart with only 6 months of fight remaining. The question now was how to spend them. The familiar creak of the boarding house door welcomed Maria Costa home, the pungent aroma of boiled cabbage wafting through the narrow hallway. Mrs. Clara Oliveira looked up from her mending, offering a sympathetic smile that asked questions Maria wasn't ready to answer. 4 years she had lived under this roof, ever since the yellow fever had swept through her family home, leaving her the sole survivor of what had once been a warm, bustling household. "There's still some stew if you're hungry, dear," the landlady called after her, but Maria merely nodded and continued up the worn wooden stairs to her room on the 3rd floor. The small chamber was just as she had left it that morning. Bed neatly made, single chair tucked beneath the simple desk, and the faded quilt her mother had stitched folded at the foot of the bed. Nothing personal adorned the walls. Maria had learned not to grow attached to places or things, or people for that matter. She sank onto the narrow mattress, her fingers absently tracing the familiar pattern of the quilt as Dr. Smith's words echoed in her mind. 6 months, perhaps less. The diagnosis felt both shocking and oddly inevitable, as though her body had been preparing her for this news all along. The evening edition of the newspaper lay where she had discarded it that morning. Maria reached for it, seeking distraction from her thoughts. She flipped through pages of political debates and society announcements that seemed to belong to another world entirely. Then, in the back pages, a small advertisement caught her eye. "Wife wanted," it read. "Rancher in Montana Territory seeks sturdy woman of good health. Must be willing to work. Write to Pedro Santos, Crow's Bend, Montana Territory." A bitter laugh escaped her lips. What cruel timing that such an advertisement would appear today of all days. Sturdy woman of good health, she was anything but that now. Yet something about the sparse, practical words called to her. Maria read the notice again, her heart quickening despite herself. Pedro Santos, a Portuguese name, like her own family. Montana Territory, a place she had only seen in illustrations, vast and wild and free. The boarding house walls suddenly felt suffocating. 4 years of existing rather than living. 4 years of watching life from the sidelines. And now, a sentence of mere months. "Why not?" she whispered to the empty room. The question hung in the air, dangerous and thrilling. Why not spend her remaining time beneath Montana's endless sky? Why not feel the sun on her face and wind in her hair, far from Boston's crowded streets and pitying glances? Maria clutched the newspaper, a plan forming in her mind. If she was going to die, she would do so having truly lived, even if it meant building her final chapter on a necessary lie. Maria Costa stared at the advertisement for a long moment, her fingers tracing the bold lettering that promised a new life in Montana Territory. The decision came with surprising swiftness, washing over her like the fever that often left her weak and trembling. She retrieved her writing paper from the small drawer beside her bed, the lamplight casting long shadows across her sparse room at Mrs. Oliveira's boarding house. With careful penmanship that belied her racing heart, she composed her response to Pedro Santos. Her nurse's training had taught her the precise medical terminology for her condition, but now she crafted beautiful lies instead. She described herself as sturdy and accustomed to hard work, mentioned her nursing experience without revealing she'd left the profession due to her failing health, and promised to be a loyal and dedicated wife. Each word felt like both betrayal and salvation. When she finished, Maria sealed the envelope with trembling fingers. The letter sat beside her lamp, innocent-looking yet weighted with consequence. She stared at it until her eyes grew heavy, finally surrendering to exhausted sleep. Her dreams that night were vivid and merciless. She was back in the crowded ward during the yellow fever epidemic, surrounded by moaning patients with jaundiced skin. Their faces morphed into those she'd lost, her mother, father, younger brother, all claimed by illness while she survived, damaged but breathing. She woke gasping, her nightgown damp with sweat, the familiar tightness squeezing her chest. As dawn's pale light filtered through her thin curtains, Maria made her final decision. If death was coming regardless, she would not meet it in this lonely room. She would see the mountains she'd only read about in dime novels. She would feel purpose again, even briefly. When Mrs. Clara Oliveira brought her morning tea, Maria confessed everything. The older woman listened without judgment, her weathered hands folded in her lap. 4 years of shared meals and quiet evenings had forged an understanding between them that required few words. "I know it's deception," Maria whispered, "but I can't bear to die here, forgotten." Mrs. Oliveira nodded slowly. "We all run from something, child. I ran from Portugal after my husband died." She reached across the small table and squeezed Maria's hand. "Post your letter, dear. I'll help you pack when he replies." The kindness in the landlady's eyes brought tears to Maria's own. She would leave Boston with at least one person to remember her. One person who understood that sometimes hope required desperate measures. That afternoon, Maria walked to the post office and sent her letter westward, toward a stranger named Pedro Santos and whatever future remained for her beneath Montana's vast sky. 3 weeks later, Maria Costa's hands trembled as she clutched the envelope bearing the Montana Territory postmark. Mrs. Olivero watched anxiously from the doorway as Maria broke the seal and unfolded Pedro Santos's response. His handwriting was bold and angular, much like the man himself, she imagined. "He's agreed," Maria whispered, her voice catching. "He wants me to come as soon as possible." The journey west unfolded like a fever dream. Maria sold her few possessions, heaping only a small trunk of necessities. Dr. Smith provided medicine for the journey, his eyes betraying his certainty that she was hastening her death. "The mountain air might do you good," he offered kindly, though they both knew it was false hope. The train from Boston carried her through landscapes that transformed with each passing day. Maria pressed her forehead against the cool glass, watching as crowded cities gave way to rolling farmland, then to vast open plains that seemed to stretch forever. At night, she wrote in her journal, documenting what might be her final adventure. In her correspondence with Pedro, Maria crafted careful half-truths. She mentioned her nursing experience, but omitted the reason she'd left the profession. She described herself as slender, rather than frail, and spoke of her desire for the clean country air, without explaining why she needed it so desperately. "I am a hard worker," she wrote in one letter, "and will be a loyal wife." The words felt hollow as she coughed into her handkerchief, checking anxiously for blood. The final leg of her journey came on a stagecoach bound for Crow's Bend. 5 days of bone-jarring travel left her exhausted, her heart fluttering dangerously in her chest. She shared the cramped space with a traveling salesman and an elderly couple heading to visit their son. "Mail-order bride?" the older woman asked, kindly, after noticing Maria's nervous fidgeting. Maria nodded, unable to deny it. "My daughter did the same," the woman confided. 10 years and 4 children later, she's never been happier. As the stagecoach crested a hill, the driver called out, "Crow's Bend, just beyond those trees." Maria's stomach knotted with fear. What if Pedro took one look at her and sent her back? What if her deception was immediately obvious? The money from selling her possessions would barely cover a return ticket. The vehicle slowed as they approached the town, and Maria caught her first glimpse of the place she hoped to call home for whatever time she had left. Her hand pressed against her chest, feeling the irregular beat beneath her fingers. "Please," she whispered to her failing heart, "just give me this chance." The stagecoach lurched to a halt, wheels grinding against the dusty main street of Crow's Bend. Maria Costa gripped her small valise tightly, knuckles white with apprehension. Through the grimy window, she observed what was to be her new home, a collection of weathered buildings scattered like forgotten toys across the Montana prairie. The vastness of the sky above made the town seem even smaller, more vulnerable. "End of the line, miss," the driver called, already unloading luggage from the roof. Maria stepped down carefully, her legs unsteady after days of travel. The thin mountain air caught in her weakened lungs, forcing her to pause and gather strength. 6 months to live, Dr. Smith had said. She wondered if the diagnosis would hold true in this wild place, where everything seemed both harsher and more alive. A small crowd had gathered to witness the stagecoach's arrival, curious eyes examining the newcomer with undisguised interest. Maria smoothed her travel-worn dress, suddenly conscious of her appearance after the long journey from Boston. "You must be Pedro's bride," a friendly voice called out. A plump woman with rosy cheeks approached, wiping flour-covered hands on her apron. "I'm Helena Martinez. I run the general store." She gestured toward a modest building across the street. Maria nodded, relieved to find a welcoming face. "Yes, I'm Maria Costa. How did you know?" Helena laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "News travels faster than stagecoaches around here. Besides, Pedro's been checking the schedule every day this week, though he'd never admit it." The shopkeeper took Maria's arm with motherly familiarity. "Come, I'll point you toward the livery. That's where he'll be waiting." As they walked, Helena lowered her voice. "He's not the friendliest soul, our Pedro. Lost too much, I think. But he's honest to the bone, and that's worth something in these parts." Maria's heart fluttered painfully in her chest, partly from exertion, partly from fear. What would this man think of her? Would he see through her deception immediately? the weight of her secret pressed down, making each step forward a conscious choice. "There he is," Helena said, nodding toward the livery stable where a tall figure stood in the shadow of the doorway. Maria swallowed hard. "Thank you for your kindness." "Good luck, dear." The shopkeeper squeezed her arm encouragingly before turning back toward her store. Alone now, Maria took a deep breath and straightened her shoulders. She had crossed a continent to reach this moment. Fear could not turn her away now. With determined steps, she moved forward to meet the man who would either become her husband or send her away when he discovered the truth. Either way, she would face her fate with dignity. Pedro Santos stood at the edge of the livery, his imposing figure drawing the attention of everyone gathered. The rancher's weather-beaten face had been sculpted by years under the Montana sun. Deep lines etched around eyes that pierced through Maria with unsettling intensity. His broad shoulders, tensed beneath a worn leather coat, gave him the appearance of a man accustomed to carrying heavy burdens alone. When Maria approached, his gaze traveled from her face to her slight frame, lingering on her delicate hands. Disappointment flickered across his features, transforming his expression from neutral to something harder. "This isn't what I ordered," he said, voice rough as gravel, loud enough for nearby townsfolk to hear. The cruel words hung in the air. Conversations around them died instantly. Dona Helena, who had kindly directed Maria to the livery, pressed her lips together in disapproval. Several men shifted uncomfortably, while a group of women exchanged knowing glances. This wasn't the first mail-order arrangement they'd witnessed, but Pedro's bluntness struck everyone as unnecessarily harsh. Heat rushed to Maria's cheeks. After the grueling journey across the country, days of rattling train cars, sleepless nights, and the final dusty stagecoach ride, to be dismissed so callously felt like a physical blow. Her lungs tightened, a familiar warning sign she couldn't afford to heed now. Instead of cowering, Maria Costa squared her shoulders and lifted her chin. The former nurse had faced death daily during the yellow fever epidemic. She wouldn't be intimidated by this man's disappointment. "I'm not a product from a catalog, Mr. Santos," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I am a woman who crossed the country to meet you." Their eyes locked in silent confrontation. For a brief moment, something shifted in Pedro's expression. Surprise, perhaps even respect, before his features hardened again. Several onlookers nodded approvingly at Maria's backbone. "Let's go," he grunted, turning abruptly toward his wagon. Maria hesitated only a second before following. As Pedro loaded her trunk, she caught fragments of whispered conversations. "Poor thing," murmured a shopkeeper. "Santos hasn't been right since Anna left." "Girl's got spirit, though," another replied. Pedro offered his hand to help Maria onto the wagon seat, a perfunctory gesture with no warmth behind it. His calloused palm briefly met hers before he released her and circled to the driver's side. As the wagon pulled away from town, Maria stole a sideways glance at the man she had traveled so far to marry. His profile remained rigid, eyes fixed on the road ahead. Whatever life awaited her at Whispering Pines, it was clear this would be no fairy tale romance. But then, Maria hadn't come for romance. She had come to live what remained of her life, with purpose. The wooden wagon creaked and swayed as it carried Maria Costa across the Montana landscape. She gripped the edge of her seat, partly from the jarring motion and partly to steady her racing heart. The vast expanse of golden prairie stretched endlessly before her, interrupted only by distant snow-capped mountains that pierced the horizon like ancient sentinels. "You'll get used to the quiet," Pedro Santos said, breaking the tense silence that had persisted since they left town. His eyes remained fixed on the path ahead, hands firmly holding the reins. "Some folks can't stand it. Too much sky, they say." Maria nodded, uncertain how to respond to this man who would soon be her husband. His profile was stern, jaw set beneath several days' growth of beard. The rancher seemed as weathered as the landscape itself, shaped by years of harsh elements and, she suspected, equally harsh experiences. "Is it far?" she finally asked, her voice nearly lost beneath the rumble of wheels. "Another hour," he replied. "Ranch sits at the edge of the forest. Better shelter from winter storms." As they traveled, Maria observed how Pedro handled the horses with practiced ease, his movements economical and precise. Occasionally, he would point out landmarks, a distinctive rock formation, the creek that fed his land, a neighbor's distant property. His words were few and practical, devoid of warmth, yet not unkind. The afternoon sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the trail. Maria's body ached from days of travel, but she found herself mesmerized by the changing light. The prairie grasses transformed from gold to amber, swaying like an ocean beneath the gentle wind. In Boston, buildings had always obstructed such views. Here, nothing stood between her and the infinite sky. "There," Pedro said as they crested a small rise. "Whispering pines." Maria's breath caught in her throat. Nestled against a dark line of pine forest stood a collection of sturdy wooden buildings. The main house, though modest, appeared solid and well-maintained, with smoke curling from its stone chimney. Nearby stood a barn, bunkhouse, and several smaller structures. A corral held horses that raised their heads at the wagon's approach. "It's beautiful," she whispered, meaning it. Pedro glanced at her, surprise briefly softening his features. "It's not much, but it's mine." As they drew closer, Maria could see a figure emerge from the main house, an older woman with a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Donna Teresa, she presumed, the housekeeper Pedro had mentioned in his letters. The wagon rolled to a stop in the yard. This place, these buildings, this land, would be her home now. For however many months her failing heart allowed her. This would be where she'd live, work, and perhaps even find purpose. Maria straightened her back and prepared to step down into her new life. The wagon came to a halt in front of a sturdy two-story house with a wide porch. Maria Costa's weary eyes took in what would be her new home, Whispering Pines Ranch, nestled against the darkening Montana sky. Before she could gather her meager belongings, the front door swung open. "You're here at last!" A plump, gray-haired woman hurried down the steps, her weathered face creasing into a warm smile. "I'm Teresa, housekeeper for 20 years now." She shot Pedro a disapproving glance before turning back to Maria with motherly concern. "You look half-starved, child." The contrast between Teresa's warmth and Pedro's icy demeanor couldn't have been more stark. While he unloaded Maria's trunk without a word, the older woman ushered her into the house, arm wrapped protectively around her shoulders. "The journey must have been terrible," Teresa clucked, leading her through a modest but clean parlor. "I've prepared the blue room for you. There's hot water for a bath and stew simmering on the stove." Araya felt tears threatening as she followed the housekeeper upstairs. Such simple kindnesses seemed overwhelming after weeks of lonely travel. The bedroom was small but comfortable, with handmade quilts and curtains that softened its frontier plainness. "Thank you," she whispered, touching Teresa's work-worn hand. "You're very kind." Later, after washing away the dust of travel and changing into a clean dress, Maria descended to the kitchen, where Pedro waited. He sat at the head of a long wooden table, his expression unreadable in the lamplight. "Meals are at 6, he stated flatly, not looking up from his coffee. "You'll take over house duties after you settle in. Teresa's hands pain her in the mornings." He paused, then added, "The preacher comes through town next week. We'll marry then if you still want to." The matter-of-fact way he discussed their union, like arranging the delivery of supplies, made Maria's chest tighten. Not from her failing heart, but from the stark reality of her situation. "I understand," she replied, keeping her voice steady. "I'm accustomed to hard work, Mr. Santos." He nodded once, then stood. "Good night, then." Without another word, he strode from the kitchen, boots echoing on the wooden floors. Teresa squeezed Maria's shoulder as she placed a bowl of stew before her. "He wasn't always so cold," she whispered. "Life has hardened him." Alone in her room that night, Maria finally allowed her tears to fall. The enormity of what she'd done, traveling across the country to marry a stranger while hiding her terminal condition, threatened to overwhelm her. But as moonlight filtered through the window, illuminating the vast Montana landscape, she wiped her eyes and straightened her shoulders. One day at a time, she resolved. She would create meaning in this borrowed life, however little of it remained. Dawn broke over Whispering Pines, with the soft golden light that made the Montana Territory feel almost magical. Maria Costa rose before the sun, her body aching, but her spirit determined. She dressed quickly in her simple cotton dress, pinning her hair neatly before making her way to the kitchen, where she found Doña Teresa already at work. "Good morning," Maria greeted the older woman, whose weathered face creased into a warm smile, despite the obvious pain in her swollen arthritic hands as she kneaded dough. "Buenos dias, child. You should be resting," Teresa replied, her accent thick but her English clear enough. The housekeeper had been running this kitchen for 15 years, and her dedication showed in every corner of the spotless room. "I'd rather be useful," Maria insisted, tying an apron around her waist. "Please, let me help with the biscuits. Your hands must be hurting today." Teresa hesitated, but relinquished the dough with a grateful nod. Together, they worked in comfortable silence, preparing a hearty breakfast of biscuits, eggs, and bacon. The older woman showed Maria where everything was kept, occasionally offering quiet instruction on how Pedro and the men preferred their meals. "They work hard," Teresa explained. "Good food keeps them strong through long days." The first rays of sunlight were streaming through the windows when heavy boots began to thump across the porch. The ranch hands filed in one by one, their curious gazes falling on Maria as they removed their hats and nodded respectfully. Sam, the foreman, entered first, a tall man with graying temples who thanked Maria with formal politeness as she served him. Young Lucas followed, barely 20, with freckles across his nose, blushing furiously when Maria smiled at him. Diego, dark-eyed and quiet, nodded his thanks without meeting her gaze. The brothers, Tomas and Francisco, entered together as they did everything. "Smells mighty fine, ma'am," Francisco offered, while his more reserved brother simply inclined his head in acknowledgement. Maria moved among them with quiet efficiency, pouring coffee and serving plates. She felt their eyes following her, assessing the woman their boss had brought home. Their curiosity was palpable, but their manners remained intact. She was refilling Sam's coffee when she felt another presence. Pedro stood in the doorway, watching her. His expression remained guarded, but something had shifted in his blue eyes, a flicker of surprise, perhaps even respect, as he observed her easy manner with his men. "Morning," he said simply, taking his seat at the head of the table. Maria served him last, carefully placing his plate before him. "Good morning, Mr. Santos," she replied, meeting his gaze steadily. For the briefest moment, the corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but the closest thing to warmth she had seen from him. It vanished quickly, but Maria tucked the memory away like a precious coin as she continued her work in what was slowly becoming her kitchen. Maria found unexpected comfort in the rhythms of Whispering Pines. Each morning, she rose before dawn, stoking the kitchen fire and preparing hearty breakfasts for the ranch hands. The routine tasks, kneading bread dough, scrubbing floors, hanging laundry in the crisp Montana air, gave structure to days that might otherwise be consumed by thoughts of her failing health. When breathlessness overtook her, she would pause, leaning against a doorframe or sitting quietly at the kitchen table until the spell passed. These moments she kept hidden, turning away when Donna Teresa's concerned gaze lingered too long, or stepping outside when her heart raced painfully in her chest. The work itself became a kind of medicine, purposeful and grounding. "You've got a good hand with those biscuits," Diego commented one morning, the usually quiet ranch hand nodding appreciatively as he finished his breakfast. The other men murmured their agreement, and Maria felt a small surge of pride. These small victories sustained her. One particularly clear afternoon, As Maria hung sheets on the line behind the main house, the sound of hoofbeats approached from the east. A striking woman astride a chestnut mare rode into the yard. Her posture regal despite the practical riding clothes she wore. Clara Martins dismounted with practiced ease, removing her gloves as she approached. "So you're Pedro's Boston bride," Clara said, her eyes taking in Maria's slight frame and pale complexion. There was no warmth in her voice, just frank assessment. "I own Silverbrook, just over the ridge." Maria extended her hand. "Maria Santos," she replied, the new surname still unfamiliar on her tongue. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Martins." Clara's handshake was firm. "Miss Martins, never married." She glanced around the yard, noting the freshly swept porch and the newly planted kitchen garden. "Place looks better than it has in years." They moved to the porch, where Maria offered coffee. As they sat, Clara studied her with unnerving directness. "Winters here are brutal. You'll need strength," she warned, her tone suggesting she found Maria lacking. Many Eastern women don't last a season. Maria met her gaze steadily. "I'm stronger than I look." The words emerged with unexpected conviction, becoming not just a defense against Clara's skepticism, but a promise to herself. Clara's expression softened slightly. "We'll see, won't we?" She sipped her coffee. "Teresa's arthritis is worse. She needs the help." As Clara departed, promising to bring seed potatoes next visit, Maria stood on the porch, watching her ride away. The neighbor's assessment had been clear. She was being measured, not just as Pedro's wife, but as someone who might belong in this harsh, beautiful place. For the first time since arriving at Whispering Pines, Maria felt not just determination, but defiance. She would prove herself, not despite her failing heart, but because of it. The days at Whispering Pines blended together as January gave way to February. Maria Costa found herself settling into a rhythm, her slender hands learning the peculiarities of the ranch house, which floorboards creaked, how the old stove needed coaxing on cold mornings, which windows caught the first light of dawn. The ranch hands, initially standoffish, began to nod respectfully when she brought them fresh coffee during their early morning work. Young Lucas even offered her a shy smile when she mended his torn shirt without being asked. Tomas and Francisco, the taciturn brothers who rarely spoke to anyone, tipped their hats when passing her in the yard. Dona Teresa watched Maria's efforts with growing approval. "You have good hands," the older woman remarked one evening as Maria kneaded bread dough. "Quick to learn." Coming from the housekeeper, this was high praise indeed. Pedro remained a shadow at the edges of her life, present at meals, absent in conversation. Yet Maria noticed the change in him. His anger had softened into something quieter, more watchful. Sometimes she would look up from her work to find his blue eyes studying her, quickly glancing away when discovered. The accident happened on a bitter Tuesday evening. Diego had been working with a new horse, a spirited mare not yet accustomed to the saddle. The animal reared unexpectedly, throwing him against the corral fence with sickening force. His screams brought everyone running. They carried the ranch hand into the house, blood soaking through his shirt where splinters from the fence had punctured his side. His left arm hung at an unnatural angle. "Get him to the table," Maria commanded, her voice cutting through the men's panic. The nurse she had once been emerged from dormancy, pushing aside the frail woman she had become. "Thomas, boil water. Lucas, fetch my trunk. There's a medical kit inside." Pedro stood frozen in the doorway, watching as Maria cut away Diego's shirt with steady hands. "Hold him down," she instructed, and the rancher moved to comply without question. For 3 hours, Maria worked. She extracted splinters, cleaned wounds, stitched torn flesh, and set the broken arm with makeshift splints. Her breathing grew labored, but her hands never trembled. She spoke softly to Diego throughout, her voice a calming anchor as she inflicted necessary pain. Pedro assisted without being asked, handing her supplies, holding lamps closer, following instructions with uncharacteristic deference. In the lamplight, he saw not the fragile mail-order bride he had dismissed, but a woman of extraordinary competence and courage. When Diego finally slept, sedated with the last of Maria's medicinal whiskey, she stepped outside for air. Pedro followed, watching as she leaned against the porch rail, exhaustion evident in the slump of her shoulders. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked, his voice lacking its usual gruffness. "I was a nurse," she answered simply, "in Boston, during the fever epidemic." Pedro nodded, something like respect flickering in his eyes. "Thank you," he said quietly, the first genuine warmth she had heard in his voice since her arrival. "Thank you," Pedro Santos murmured. His weathered face softened in the amber glow of the oil lamp. The words hung between them, simple yet monumental. The first genuine warmth Maria had heard from him since stepping off the stagecoach weeks ago. She nodded, her hands still trembling slightly from the intensity of the past hours. Lucas, the youngest ranch hand, lay sleeping on the cot before them, his breathing finally steady after the accident with the spooked stallion. The boy's shoulder had been dislocated, his arm broken, and a deep gash across his temple had required Maria's careful stitching. "I didn't know you were a nurse," Pedro said, watching her clean the bloodied cloths. "In Boston, during the fever epidemic," Maria replied, not meeting his eyes. "You learn quickly when death is everywhere." She didn't add how that same epidemic had claimed her family, leaving her utterly alone. The rancher stood awkwardly by the doorway, as if uncertain whether to leave or stay. "You should rest. I can watch him." Maria shook her head. "I'll stay a while longer. Go, get some sleep." After Pedro left, the house settled into night sounds, creaking timbers, distant coyote calls, the soft snoring of Lucas. Maria sank into the wooden chair beside the cot, exhaustion washing over her. Yet beneath the fatigue burned something unfamiliar: purpose. For months in Boston, she had merely existed, counting down days, waiting for her failing heart to surrender. But tonight, her hands had been steady, her mind clear. She had been needed, truly needed. Diego and Tomas had looked at her with newfound respect when she'd calmly instructed them to hold Lucas still. Even Francisco, always distant, had nodded appreciatively when she'd finished the last stitch, and Pedro, the way he'd handed her supplies without question, trusting her judgment completely. Maria touched her chest, feeling the irregular flutter beneath her ribs. The doctor's words echoed. 6 months. Yet here she was, fighting not just for her own life, but for another's. Fighting to belong in this harsh landscape that demanded everything and promised nothing. Dawn was breaking when Dona Teresa entered with a steaming cup of coffee. The elderly housekeeper studied Maria's pale face with knowing eyes. "You did good," Teresa said, pressing the warm cup into Maria's hands. "The boy will heal because of you." "I just did what needed doing." Teresa's arthritic fingers patted Maria's shoulder. "That's how we survive out here. That's how we become family." Family. The words settled in Maria's chest, alongside a feeling she dared not name. Not yet. But as she sipped the bitter coffee and watched the sunrise paint the Montana sky, she recognized it growing there. Love. Not just for this place or these people, but for the life she was building, however brief it might be. The small church in Crow's Bend had never seen such a crowd. Word had spread like wildfire across the territory that Pedro Santos, the reclusive rancher from Whispering Pines, was marrying his mail-order bride. Townsfolk pressed shoulder to shoulder in the wooden pews, necks craning for a glimpse of the mysterious woman who had traveled across the country to marry a man she'd never met. Maria Costa stood alone at the back of the church, her hands trembling slightly as they clutched a small bouquet of wildflowers. She wore her best dress, faded blue cotton, carefully mended and pressed for the occasion. The fabric hung loosely on her thin frame, a silent testament to her declining health, though she'd pinched color into her cheeks that morning. "Are you ready, child?" Reverend Williams asked kindly, his weathered face creasing with a gentle smile. Maria nodded, unable to find her voice. As the piano began a halting rendition of the wedding march, she took her first step down the aisle. Her gaze fixed on Pedro, who stood stiffly at the altar, his expression unreadable beneath his neatly trimmed beard. From the front pew, Donna Teresa dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. The housekeeper had insisted on arranging flowers for the altar and had helped Maria prepare that morning, her arthritic hands carefully pinning Maria's hair. In just weeks, the older woman had become the closest thing to family Maria had in this wild territory. "Who gives this woman?" the Reverend asked, his voice echoing in the hushed church. A moment of silence followed, a stark reminder of Maria's solitude. Then, Teresa stood shakily. "I do," she announced, her voice strong despite her tears. The ceremony itself was brief. Pedro's responses were clear and firm, while Maria's came softer, but no less determined. When they exchanged rings, simple bands that Pedro had purchased from the general store, Maria noticed his hands were steady, though calloused from years of ranch work. "You may kiss your bride," Reverend Williams declared. Pedro leaned forward, placing a brief, chaste kiss on Maria's lips. It lasted only a moment, but in that touch, she felt something unexpected: gentleness. As they turned to face the congregation as husband and wife, applause erupted. Maria saw Clara Martins nodding approvingly from the back, while the ranch hands whooped enthusiastically. Even Sam, the most taciturn of the bunch, managed a smile. For Maria, this moment transcended the simple ceremony. It was her declaration to fate itself. She would not slip quietly from this world, forgotten and alone. She would leave as Maria Santos, a woman who belonged somewhere, to someone. Whatever time remained would be lived fully, with purpose and dignity. As they walked back down the aisle, Pedro briefly covered her hand with his. The small gesture, hidden from the crowd, felt like a promise. Not of passionate love, perhaps, but of something equally precious: respect. Winter descended upon Whispering Pines with merciless fury. Snow piled against the windows, and bitter winds howled through every crack in the sturdy ranch house. Maria Costa huddled near the kitchen stove, her fingers trembling as she peeled potatoes for the evening meal. The cold seemed to seep into her bones, making her heart labor with each beat. She'd grown skilled at hiding her symptoms from the household. When breathlessness overtook her, she'd excuse herself to fetch something from the pantry. When pain stabbed through her chest, she masked it with a cough or a smile. The ranch hands noticed nothing, too busy with winter chores to pay attention to the pallor of her skin. Pedro Santos remained as distant as the frozen mountains on the horizon. Though legally her husband, he spent long hours in the barn or riding fence lines, returning only for meals and sleep. Maria caught him sometimes, staring into the fire with haunted eyes, lost in memories he wouldn't share. Donna Teresa knew something was amiss. The elderly housekeeper would press herbal teas into Maria's hands, watching with knowing eyes as the younger woman struggled through her daily tasks. "You need rest, child," she'd whisper, but Maria would only shake her head. One evening, as snow fell in thick curtains outside, Pedro finally spoke of his past. "Anna left in winter," he said, voice rough as he stared into his coffee. "Took my unborn child and ran off with a cattle buyer from Chicago." His calloused fingers tightened around the cup. "Never even told me if it was a boy or girl." Maria reached across the table, but before her fingers could touch his, a violent coughing fit seized her. She doubled over, struggling for breath, and when she pulled her handkerchief away, bright crimson blood stained the white fabric. Pedro's chair scraped against the floor as he stood. "What is this?" he demanded, anger and fear warring in his voice. "I'm sorry," Maria whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I should have told you." That night, huddled beneath quilts in the bedroom they rarely shared, Maria confessed everything. Dr. Smith's diagnosis, the 6 months she'd been given, her desperate search for meaning before the end. "You lied to me," Pedro said, pacing the small room. "You came here dying. I came here to live, Maria countered, her voice stronger than it had been in weeks. To matter to someone before I go. To see something beautiful. To not die alone in a boarding house where no one would notice for days. The rancher stopped pacing, his blue eyes fixed on her face. For the first time, he truly saw her. Not as a disappointing mail-order bride, but as a woman of extraordinary courage. "How much time?" he asked, his voice barely audible above the howling wind. "I don't know anymore," Maria admitted. "Each day is a gift I didn't expect." The silence in the cabin stretched between them like a physical presence. Maria's confession hung in the air, her secret finally exposed. Pedro Santos stood by the fireplace, his broad shoulders tense, one hand gripping the mantel as he processed what she had revealed. "You came here knowing you were dying," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "You lied to me." Maria nodded, unable to deny it. "I wanted to matter to someone before I died. I wanted to be more than just another patient wasting away in Boston." Pedro turned to face her, moonlight from the window casting half his weather-beaten face in shadow. "My first wife lied too," he said quietly. "Anna told me she loved me, bore my child, then left with a cattle buyer from Chicago. Took my son with her, Eduardo. He'd be 8 now." His voice cracked slightly. "I don't even know what he looks like." Maria sat still on the edge of their bed, her hands folded in her lap. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I built walls after that," Pedro continued, moving to sit beside her. "Turned myself to stone. Figured it was safer that way." Outside, the winter wind howled across the Montana prairie, rattling the windows of Whispering Pines. Inside, something fragile was taking shape between them. "You know what's strange?" Pedro asked, his blue eyes meeting hers. "When I look at you, I see someone fighting the same battle I've been fighting. You're dying in your body, but refusing to die in spirit. I've been alive in body, but dead inside." Maria felt tears well in her eyes. "I never meant to hurt you. I know that now." His calloused hand reached for hers, hesitantly at first, then with certainty. "When I saw you coughing blood, I wasn't angry because you deceived me. I was terrified of losing you." The rancher's admission hung between them, honest and raw. For the first time since her arrival, he called her by her first name, his voice tender with an emotion neither had dared name before. "Maria," he said softly, "you're my wife now. Whatever time we have, we face it together." She leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him. "I don't know how long I have." "None of us do," Pedro replied, his arm encircling her waist. "But I'm done wasting days on bitterness." That night, they talked until dawn, about Boston and her nursing days, about his childhood in Portugal before coming to America, about dreams neither had shared with another soul. When morning light crept through the cabin windows, something had changed. The walls between them had crumbled, revealing two wounded hearts finding unexpected healing in each other's company. The winter winds gradually surrendered to spring's gentle touch, and with the changing season came a transformation within the walls of Whispering Pines. Maria Costa found herself breathing easier, the clean Montana air seemingly working miracles on her failing heart. Each morning, she woke with a strange new feeling, hope, unfurling in her chest like the tender green shoots emerging from the thawing earth. Pedro noticed the change in her, commenting one evening as they sat by the hearth, "Your cheeks have color now." His voice carried none of the gruffness that had once defined him. Instead, his blue eyes held a warmth that made Maria's pulse quicken in ways her illness never had. The rancher was changing too. Where silence had once stretched between them, stories now flowed. He spoke of his childhood in Portugal before his family journeyed to America, of summers spent learning to ride from his grandfather, of his dreams for Whispering Pines. Maria treasured these glimpses into his past, collecting them like precious stones. Their evenings became a sacred ritual. After the ranch hands retired and Dona Teresa finished in the kitchen, husband and wife would claim the chairs nearest the fire. Sometimes Pedro would read aloud from dog-eared books, tales of adventure that transported them beyond Montana's vast horizons. Maria would listen, mending clothes, or simply watching the firelight play across his features, marveling at how this man who had once seemed carved from stone now smiled so readily. "My mother used to say that love isn't born in grand moments," Maria confided one night as Pedro handed her a steaming cup of tea prepared just as she liked it. "She said it grows in small kindnesses, repeated day after day." He considered this, calloused fingers brushing hers as he settled beside her. "Your mother was wise." These small kindnesses accumulated, Pedro bringing wildflowers from the pasture, Maria leaving notes in his saddlebag. Shared laughter over Lucas's latest mishap with the new foal. When Maria's breath grew short one evening, he wordlessly moved her chair closer to the open window, then returned to his book without making her feel fragile or broken. During a particularly fierce spring storm, Maria awoke trembling from nightmares of Boston and illness. Without question, Pedro held her until the shaking subsided. "I'm here," he whispered against her hair. "Whatever comes, we face it together." In those quiet weeks, as the land reawakened around them, Maria discovered that love could be built not through dramatic declarations or passionate promises, but through the steady rhythm of two lives gradually intertwining, a gentle touch, a shared joke, a cup of tea prepared with care. The first gentle breeze of spring swept across Whispering Pines, carrying with it the scent of new grass and the promise of renewal. Maria Costa stood on the porch, her shawl wrapped loosely around her shoulders, marveling. The tranquility was shattered one afternoon when Pedro returned from town, his face etched with worry. "Railroad men," he announced, dropping his hat on the table with unusual force. "They're planning to cut straight through our land, right through the north pasture and the creek." Maria watched her husband pace the kitchen floor, his weathered hands clenched into fists. The north pasture wasn't just land. It was where Pedro had buried his parents, where the best grazing lay, where generations of Santos men had worked the soil. "They can't just take it," she said, reaching for his arm. "They have government backing," Pedro replied, his voice hollow. "Progress, they call it." The next morning, Maria sent Lucas riding to Clara Martins's ranch with an urgent message. By noon, the formidable neighbor arrived, her riding clothes dusty, but her bearing regal as ever. "Those railroad vultures tried the same with my father's land years back," Clara said, spreading maps across the dining table. "We need to show a united front." For 2 weeks, Pedro worked tirelessly, riding to neighboring ranches, meeting with town officials, and poring over property documents with Tomas, who had once studied law. Maria organized the ranch wives into a committee that provided meals for every meeting and gathered signatures from townsfolk who depended on Whispering Pines cattle. "You're fighting like you were born to this land," Pedro told her one night, his blue eyes soft with admiration. Maria smiled, touching her chest where her heart still fluttered unpredictably. "This is our home. I won't let them take it without a fight." When the railroad representatives returned, they faced not one rancher but a community. Pedro, with Maria and Clara flanking him, presented their counterproposal, a route that would skirt the eastern boundary of Whispering Pines, preserving the heart of the ranch while still connecting to Crow's Bend. After tense negotiations, the railroad conceded. That evening, as neighbors gathered to celebrate, Pedro stood in the yard, his expression complex. "We won," he said to Maria, "but the railroad still comes. The frontier is changing." She slipped her hand into his. "But we're changing with it, on our terms." For Pedro, the victory was bittersweet, progress encroaching on the wilderness he loved. But for Maria, watching him accept congratulations from ranch hands and neighbors, it was confirmation of what she dared not hope. She had become not just his wife, but his partner, indispensable to the life they were building together. Spring arrived at Whispering Pines, with a gentle persistence that mirrored Maria Costa's own journey. The harsh Montana winter receded, revealing emerald pastures dotted with wildflowers and the wobbly legs of newborn calves. The ranch hands moved with renewed energy, their voices carrying across the fields as they mended fences and tended to the growing herd. Maria found herself breathing easier in the warming air. Though her heart still troubled her on occasion, she'd discovered a strange paradox. In this place where she'd come to die, she was somehow growing stronger. Each morning, she rose with purpose, her steps steadier as she moved through the home that had become truly hers. Pedro noticed the change in her. "You have color in your cheeks," he remarked one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. His calloused hand covered hers, a gesture that had become natural between them. "It's the mountain air," she replied with a smile. "Or perhaps it's happiness." Their quiet moment was interrupted when Tomas rode in with the mail delivery. Among the usual correspondence was an envelope bearing unfamiliar handwriting. Pedro's expression darkened as he recognized the sender. "It's from Anna," he said, his voice tight. He broke the seal and read silently, the muscles in his jaw working. Later that night, after the ranch had settled into darkness, Pedro shared the letter's contents. His former wife had written that their son, Eduardo, was asking questions about his father. "She wants to bring him here," he explained, pacing the bedroom floor. "She says it's time he knew me." Maria sat on the edge of their bed, watching her husband struggle with emotions long buried. "What do you want to do?" she asked gently. "I don't know," Pedro admitted. "I've imagined meeting my boy 1,000 times. But Anna," he trailed off, the betrayal still raw after all these years. Maria rose and placed her hands on his shoulders. "The spring celebration is in 2 weeks. Everyone from miles around will be here. Perhaps that would be a good time for Eduardo to meet his father, surrounded by community with less pressure." Pedro looked uncertain. "And you? How would you feel having her here?" "This isn't about me or Anna," Maria replied. "It's about a boy who deserves to know his father. And perhaps," she hesitated, "perhaps it's also about letting go of old wounds so new joy can grow." The rancher gazed at his wife, marveling at her wisdom. In the woman he'd once dismissed as too fragile, he'd found unexpected strength. With a deep breath, he nodded. "I'll write to her tomorrow. The celebration seems fitting. New beginnings all around." That night, as Pedro slept beside her, Maria whispered a prayer of gratitude for this chance to help heal the family she'd come to love. A family that, against all odds, had become her own. The spring celebration at Whispering Pines Ranch bloomed with life and color. The morning sun cast golden light across the decorated yard where tables had been arranged in neat rows. Maria Costa stood on the porch, smoothing the folds of her handmade blue dress, watching as neighbors and friends arrived in wagons and on horseback. "You look beautiful," Dona Teresa said, patting Maria's arm before hurrying back to the kitchen, where the scents of roasted meat, fresh bread, and apple pies mingled enticingly. Maria's cheeks were flushed with an unusual healthy glow. For the first time in months, her heart condition seemed to grant her a reprieve, allowing her to enjoy the day without constant reminders of her mortality. She had sewn the dress herself over many evenings, each stitch a quiet act of hope. Pedro moved through the gathering crowd, shaking hands and accepting congratulations on the ranch's prosperity. His eyes frequently sought Maria's across the yard, a silent communication that had grown between them. When the music started, fiddles and guitars played by the ranch hands, children began dancing while adults clapped along. The celebration was in full swing when a carriage appeared on the horizon. Conversation faltered as it approached. Maria reached for Pedro's hand as Ana stepped down, elegant in a city dress that seemed out of place among the practical frontier clothing. Behind her, a small boy with dark hair hesitated. "That's Eduardo," Clara Martins whispered to Maria. "He has Pedro's eyes, doesn't he?" The crowd parted as Anna led the child forward. Eduardo looked around with cautious curiosity, his gaze finally settling on Pedro. The resemblance was unmistakable. The same piercing blue eyes, the same determined set of the jaw. "Are you really my father?" the boy asked, his voice carrying in the sudden silence. Pedro knelt slowly, bringing himself to eye level with his son. His hands trembled slightly as he placed them on Eduardo's shoulders. "Yes, son, I am," he answered, voice rough with emotion. The boy studied Pedro's face intently, as if memorizing every feature. Then, like sunshine breaking through clouds, Eduardo smiled, a smile that erased 8 years of absence in an instant. Maria watched, her heart swelling with unexpected joy. The ranch hands resumed their music, and Tomas called for a dance. As Pedro awkwardly showed his son around the ranch he would one day inherit, Maria exchanged a civil nod with Anna. There would be complications to navigate, wounds still healing, but today was for celebration. In this moment, beneath Montana's vast sky, Maria felt truly alive. She had found not just a husband, but a family, one pieced together from broken parts, yet somehow stronger for having been mended. Lanterns swayed in the gentle evening breeze, casting golden light across the yard of whispering pines. The celebration had transformed the ranch into something magical. Tables adorned with wildflowers, music drifting from Diego's fiddle, and the scent of Dona Teresa's apple pie mingling with the crisp Montana air. Maria Costa Santos stood beside Pedro, her blue handmade dress catching the light as they faced their gathered friends and neighbors. "I didn't come here expecting love," Maria said, her voice clear despite her condition. "I came here to die with dignity." A hush fell over the crowd. "Instead, I found a reason to live." Pedro Santos took her hands in his, those weather-beaten fingers now gentle against her skin. The man who had once greeted her with cold disappointment now looked at her with devotion that needed no explanation. Clara Martins dabbed at her eyes, her usual formidable demeanor softened by the moment. "When you told me the truth about your heart," Pedro said, "I realized I'd been given a second chance to open mine." His voice, usually so practical and reserved, trembled slightly. "Whatever time we have together, whether years or days, I choose to spend it loving you." Eduardo stood between them, his small hand reaching up to join theirs. The boy's laughter had filled the ranch house these past weeks, healing wounds Pedro had carried for 8 years. Anna watched from nearby, her expression a complex mixture of regret and peace. As the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, again, but this time with truth between them, cheers erupted from the ranch hands. Sam tossed his hat in the air, while young Lucas whistled sharply. Even the stoic brothers Tomas and Francisco broke into wide grins. Later, as stars emerged in the vast Montana sky, Maria and Pedro swayed together near the barn. The celebration continued around them, but they had created a world of their own. "I never told you," Maria whispered, "but that first day in Crow's Bend, when you looked so disappointed, I almost got back on the stagecoach." Pedro chuckled, the sound rumbling through his chest. "And I almost sent you back." He pulled her closer. "I thank God every day that we're both too stubborn." Maria rested her head against his shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart. Her own heart, though damaged, felt fuller than she'd ever thought possible. She caught sight of Eduardo playing with the other children, his laughter carrying across the yard. "Whatever time we have," Pedro murmured into her hair, "I am grateful for every day with you." In the embrace of the wild frontier, beneath the endless Montana sky, they had found something stronger than fate, hope, healing, and the courage to begin again.